your own Miss Lovie welcomes you to another story. This one is different. This one is about survival and soul and the way blood calls to blood across centuries. This one is going to make you believe in something bigger than yourself, something that was working on your behalf long before you were born. Because tonight ain't just the video. Tonight is a family reunion, 180 years in the making. Tonight is about a promise two teenagers made to each other in the belly of a slave ship. A promise so powerful it echoed through 5 generations until it found its way home. Tonight is about the kind of love that doesn't die when the body does. The kind that lives in rhythms and whispers and the way your grandmother hums when she thinks nobody's listening. So before we go any further, I want you to do something for Miss Lovie. Drop your city, your country, your village down in the comments below. Let me know where you've joined your Miss Lovie from tonight. Let's get back to our story now. It was the spring of 1860, and the world was about to witness the last illegal slave ship to ever touch American soil. Think about that for a moment. The last one. 52 years after the international slave trade had been outlawed, some greedy, evil man still thought he could steal souls and get away with it. Her name was the Clotilda. She was a sleek, wicked, beautiful thing built for one purpose: speed. Built to outrun the law, built to slip through the Gulf of Mexico like a ghost that refused to die, built to carry human cargo as if people were no more sacred than sugar or rum. In her belly, packed like kindling, chained like animals, stripped of everything but their breath and their will to survive, were 110 stolen African souls. The youngest was barely 10 years old, still had baby fat in his cheeks, still believed his mother would find him. The oldest was not yet 30, a warrior taken mid-battle, his hand still reaching for the spear they'd torn from his grip. Among those 110 were 2 souls that would change the future in ways neither could imagine. Their names were Gumpa and Abial. Gumpa was 16 years old, tall for his age, with shoulders already broad from working the land, with eyes that had seen too much too soon. He was taken from a village near the town of Odia and what we now call Benin, ripped from his father's compound during a raid that came at dawn when the mist was still thick and the roosters hadn't yet learned to be afraid. Abiel was 14, small but fierce, with the kind of spirit that couldn't be broken no matter how hard you tried. She was snatched from that same raid, torn from her mother's arms, while her mother's scream split the morning air like lightning. That scream followed Abiel into the ship, into the hold, into her dreams every single night for the rest of her life. They were chained side by side in the darkness for 52 days straight. Let me say that again so you feel the weight of it. 52 days in darkness so complete you couldn't see your own hand in front of your face. 52 days breathing air thick with fear and waste and death. 52 days listening to people die around you, their last words in languages you understood, their silence even louder. But in that darkness, with death breathing hot on every neck, with hope seeming like a luxury they couldn't afford, something holy happened. Something that would reach across time itself. Gumpa started tapping on the wooden hull. 2 beats slow, 1 beat fast. It was the rhythm his grandmother used to call the moon during harvest ceremonies. The rhythm that meant, I am here, I am alive, I am not alone. His fingers found a piece of the ship that wasn't covered in filth, and he tapped it like a prayer. Tap, 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 tap. From the other side of the chain, in the suffocating blackness, Abiel heard it, and something in her soul recognized it, even though they'd never met, even though they came from different villages, even though they spoke different dialects. That rhythm was older than both of them, older than the ship, older than slavery itself. It was the language of survival, the Morse code of the human spirit refusing to be extinguished. She answered back, same rhythm, same heartbeat, tap, tap, tap. For 52 days, they never saw each other's faces. The darkness was too thick, too absolute, but they learned each other's souls by the way their shackles sang together, by the rhythm they shared back and forth, like a secret, like a lifeline, like a promise that they would both make it through. They couldn't speak the same language fully. His tongue shaped words differently than hers, but the rhythm was a language older than words, deeper than vocabulary, more true than any promise that could be spoken. I'm still here. Me too. Hold on. Don't give up. I won't if you won't. When the Clotilda finally dropped anchor in the Mobile River under cover of night, the captain knew he had committed a crime. The ship was evidence. The people in chains were evidence. Everything about this voyage was evidence of evil that the law had already declared illegal. So he did what evil men do when they're afraid to get caught. He set the ship on fire. He forced 110 exhausted, starving, traumatized people to choose between burning alive or jumping into the black water of a river they'd never seen, in a country they didn't know. The captives, they weren't slaves yet. They were captives, stolen people, kidnapped souls. Had to swim or sink, jump or burn, choose between one death and another. Gumpa grabbed Abil's hand in that black water. He found her in the chaos and the smoke and the screaming, found her by instinct, by the same force that had connected them in the darkness below deck. Their fingers locked together as they hit the cold shock of the river, and he whispered in the only language they still shared, the language of survival. Hold on to me. We gon' live. And they did. They kicked toward the shore with their lungs burning and their muscles screaming, and the weight of 52 days and change trying to pull them down. They held on to each other like they were holding on to life. Because they were. They made it to the muddy bank, coughing up river water and ship smoke, shaking with cold and terror and something that might have been hope if hope hadn't seemed so foolish. They survived the water, they survived the fire, they survived the ship, but they had no idea what was waiting for them on dry land. The man who bought them, and yes, I said bought, because even though the slave trade was illegal, slavery itself was still legal, still profitable, still the foundation of the Southern economy. These men split Gumpa and Abile up the very next morning. Just like that. No consideration for the fact that they'd survived hell together. No care that they'd kept each other alive through 52 days of darkness. No recognition that their hands had found each other in the burning river and refused to let go until they reached the shore. None of that mattered to men who saw people as property. Gumpa went to a plantation 20 miles north of Mobile, a cotton plantation where the work was endless and the overseer's whip was quick. They changed his name immediately, gave him some English name he couldn't pronounce, a name that had nothing to do with who he was or where he came from. But in his heart, in the quiet places they couldn't reach, he stayed Gumpa. He held on to that name like he held on to the rhythm. Abile went 12 miles south to a different plantation, this one growing sugar cane, the kind of work that broke backs and shortened lives.
the kind of labor that killed slowly and without mercy. They renamed her, too, tried to strip away the girl she'd been, tried to make her forget the language she spoke and the mother who'd screamed her name. But some things can't be forgotten. Some things live deeper than memory. They never saw each other again in this life, never got to speak face to face, never got to say the things that needed saying, never got to look each other in the eyes in daylight and see the person who'd saved them in the dark. But every single night for the rest of their days, they tapped that same rhythm on whatever was closest. Goompa tapped it on the wooden post of his sleeping quarters, on the cotton gin when the overseer wasn't looking, on the trunk of the oak tree where he'd steal 5 minutes of rest, on his own chest when there was nothing else, his heartbeat becoming the drum, his ribs becoming the instrument. Tap, tap, tap. I'm still here. Abile tapped it on the side of the sugar kettle, on the door frame of the quarters she shared with 12 other women, on the smooth river stones she'd collect and keep hidden in her pocket, on her own thigh when she was too tired to lift her hand. Tap, tap, tap. I remember you. They tapped it to remind themselves they were human. They tapped it to remind the ancestors they were still fighting. They tapped it because it was the only thing left from before, the only language that hadn't been stolen, the only connection to a boy and a girl who'd promised each other life. Years passed like they do in slavery, slow and fast at the same time. Every day exactly the same. Every day another piece of your soul you had to hide to keep it safe. And then one day in 1865, everything changed. A man came riding through on horseback with news that seemed too big to be true, too impossible to believe. The war was over. The Union had won. And with the stroke of Abraham Lincoln's pen, 4 million enslaved people were suddenly, legally, impossibly free. Emancipation came like a thunderclap. Some people celebrated immediately, running toward freedom before the slaveholders could change their minds. Some people stayed frozen, unable to believe it was real, afraid it was a trick. Some people had been beaten down so long they didn't know what freedom even meant anymore. But Goompa and Abile, they knew exactly what they needed to do. They started walking back toward Mobile. Goompa set out from the north, asking every soul he met the same question. You remember a girl named Abile from the burning ship? Young girl, fierce spirit, survived the Clotilda? Most people shook their heads. Some people gave him suspicious looks, wondering why he was asking, wondering if this was some trap. But he kept asking, kept walking, kept believing that somehow, somewhere, she was asking about him too. Abile walked from the south, asking everyone she encountered, You know a boy named Goompa? Tall, strong, came on the last ship. We was chained together. We survived the water together. Some people thought she was crazy. Some people told her to let it go, to focus on the future instead of the past. But she couldn't let it go, wouldn't let it go, because that boy in the darkness had been more real to her than anything since. They searched for each other through the chaos of Reconstruction, through the confusion of freedom that came without money or land or protection, through the danger of Southern roads where freed Black people were still being murdered for the crime of believing they were human. And they missed each other by 3 weeks. 3 weeks. Goompa arrived in Mobile in July, asking about Abile, searching through the camps of freed people, checking every face, listening for that rhythm. Abile arrived in Mobile in August, asking about Goompa, walking the same streets he'd just walked, sleeping in a shelter he'd slept in the week before, missing him by days, by hours, by the cruelest margin. If he'd stayed a little longer, if she'd left a little earlier, if someone had remembered better or spoken up sooner. If. But life doesn't work on ifs. Life works on what is. And what is was this. Goomba settled on the north side of Mobile with other Clotilda survivors. They pooled their money, bought land together, built houses with their own hands, created something unprecedented, a community of Africans in America who remembered Africa, who refused to forget their names, their languages, their religions. They called it Africa Town. Abile settled on the south side of Mobile with her own group of survivors. They did the very same thing, bought land, built homes, planted gardens with seeds they'd saved, created a space where they could be African and free at the same time. Two communities, same city, same story, same ship, just on opposite sides of town. Goomba married another Clotilda survivor, a woman named Amma, who understood survival because she'd lived it too. He built her a house with his hands, gave her children, gave her safety. But on their wedding night, he told her about Abile, about the girl in the darkness, about the rhythm. And Amma, wise and kind and strong, said, "Then we keep looking. We teach the children to keep looking." Abile married, too, a man named Kofi who'd come on a different ship years earlier, who knew what it meant to be stolen, who didn't question why she tapped on walls when she thought no one was listening. She bore him children, created a home, built a life. But she told every child the same story. "Somewhere in this town is a boy named Goomba. He held my hand in the water. If you ever meet him, you tell him Abile never forgot." The years rolled on like the Alabama River, slow, steady, relentless. Children became grandchildren, grandchildren became great-grandchildren, the great-grandchildren became great-great-grandchildren. The generations stacked up like layers of sediment, each one carrying the story forward, each one adding their own survival to the narrative. The story got told at every funeral, every baptism, every Juneteenth fish fry, every family reunion. It became part of the family mythology, part of the inheritance, more valuable than land or money or anything you could hold in your hand. The elders would gather the young ones close and say, "Somewhere in this town is the other half of your blood that survived the water with us. They're living their life just like we're living ours. Keep your ears open. Keep tapping the rhythm. One day somehow, blood gon' call the blood." And the children would listen, wide-eyed and serious, and promise to remember. They learned the rhythm, tap, 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 the same way they learned to pray, to tie their shoes, to write their names. It became muscle memory, soul memory, the kind of knowledge that lives in your bones before it reaches your brain. And they waited. Generation after generation, they waited. Not knowing if it would happen, not knowing how it could happen, just knowing that somewhere in Africa Town, their people had made a promise that needed keeping. 164 years is a long time to wait for anything. But ancestors are patient. They know that some promises take longer than a lifetime to keep.
Fast forward 164 years to June 15th, 2024. A warm Saturday afternoon in Alabama, the kind where the heat sits on your skin like a blanket and the air smells like magnolia and cut grass. The kind of day where the past feels close, where you can almost hear it if you listen right. A girl named Zora Lewis, 26 years old, fifth-generation descendant of Abile, was home from California for her cousin's wedding. Let me tell you about Zora. She was a marine biologist, spent her days studying ocean currents and coral reefs, understanding water in ways her ancestors would have found miraculous. She wore her hair in locks down to her waist, had her great-grandmother's cheekbones, and carried herself with the kind of quiet confidence that came from knowing exactly who she was and where she came from. She'd grown up hearing the story of Abile, heard it so many times she could recite it like scripture.
Her grandmother had made her memorize the rhythm before she learned her ABCs, made her practice it until it was automatic, until her hands knew it even when her mind was thinking about something else. "One day this gonna matter," her grandmother had said. "I don't know when, I don't know how, but Mr. Bile didn't teach me this rhythm for no reason. You keep it, you pass it on, you trust that it's gonna find its way home." Zora had always believed her grandmother, but she'd also thought it was metaphorical, a beautiful story about faith and heritage and keeping cultural memory alive. She didn't think it was literal, didn't think there was actually someone out there still tapping the same rhythm, still carrying the other half of the story. That Saturday afternoon, she was walking through Africatown Plateau Cemetery looking for her great-great-grandmother's grave. She wanted to leave flowers before the wedding, wanted to pay respects, wanted to tell Abile's spirit that the family was still here, still thriving, still remembering. The cemetery was quiet except for cicadas singing in the trees and the occasional car passing on the road beyond the fence. Spanish moss hung from the old oak trees like curtains between worlds. The gravestones ranged from new polished marble to old weathered concrete, some leaning, some straight, all of them marking lives that mattered, stories that deserved remembering. Zora was wearing sandals, cute ones with thin straps that weren't really made for walking through cemetery grass, and naturally, inevitably, the strap broke. She stopped, knelt down by a gravestone to fix it, balancing on one foot while trying to thread the strap back through the buckle. And while she worked, she started humming without thinking, started tapping without meaning to. 2 slow taps with her knuckle against the gravestone. 1 fast. Tap, tap, tap. It was automatic, muscle memory, the same thing she did when she was nervous or thinking hard or waiting for something. Her grandmother used to do it. Her mother did it. She did it. It was just part of being an Abile descendant. She didn't expect anyone to hear it. She definitely didn't expect anyone to answer. But 50 yards away, on the other side of the cemetery, someone did. His name was Kasala Reed. 28 years old, 5th-generation descendant of Gumpa, architect from Atlanta, home to help restore the Clotilda exhibit that had just been raised from the Mobile River. The actual ship had been discovered a few years back, sitting on the river bottom like a ghost that was finally ready to tell its story. Kasala had volunteered to help design the memorial, to create something that would honor the 110 souls who had survived that journey. He was tall like Gumpa had been, with careful hands and watchful eyes, the kind of man who noticed things other people missed. He'd grown up hearing about the boy in chains, about the rhythm, about the promise to keep looking. His grandfather had taught him the tapping before he taught him to read, had made him practice it until it lived in his bones. "This ain't just family history," his grandfather had said. "This is a sacred trust. Gumpa survived so you could be here. The least you can do is remember how he did it." That afternoon, Kasala was doing the same thing Zora was doing, looking for his ancestor's grave, wanting to pay respects, wanting to feel connected to the man whose story he carried. He was leaning against an oak tree, reading the inscription on a nearby gravestone, when he heard it through the cicada song. Tap, tap, tap. He froze. His whole body went still like somebody had walked over his grave, like the temperature had dropped 20 degrees, like the air itself had changed frequency. He knew that rhythm, had known it his whole life, but he'd never heard anyone else do it except family. His hands answered before his brain caught up. 2 slow taps on the oak tree trunk, 1 fast. Tap, tap, tap. 50 yards away, Zora's head snapped up so fast she almost lost her balance. Her sandal forgotten, her heart suddenly pounding, she straightened up and looked around wildly. Someone had just answered the rhythm her great-great-grandmother had learned on a slave ship. She answered back, louder this time, tapping on a marble gravestone with her knuckles. Tap, tap, tap. Kasala started walking toward the sound. He didn't decide to walk. His feet just moved, like they were being pulled by something older than thought, deeper than choice. Like a string that had been tied to his soul 164 years ago was finally being pulled taut. Zora started walking too, weaving between gravestones, her broken sandal flapping, her breath coming quick, her mind racing through impossible possibilities. They met under the same live oak tree that had watched their ancestors plant the first gardens of Africatown.
the same tree that had given shade to people who survived the unsurvivable, the same tree that had stood witness to 164 years of waiting. They stopped about 10 feet apart, staring at each other, both breathing hard, both looking like they'd seen a ghost. Zora spoke first, her voice shaking. "Who taught you that rhythm?" Kasala's voice came out rough, thick with emotion he didn't understand yet. "My great-granddaddy Gumpa, from the ship, the Clotilda. He taught my granddaddy, who taught my father, who taught me. It's been in my family since 1860. Zora's eyes filled with tears so fast she didn't have time to stop them. "My great-great-grandmama Abiel taught my granny the same one, from the same ship. She said it was the rhythm a boy tapped in the darkness, and she tapped it back, and they survived because they weren't alone." The words hung between them like a bridge finally completing itself, like two halves of a circle finding each other after spinning in separate orbits for more than a century. Kasala took a step closer. "Abiel. Your ancestor's name was Abiel?" Zora nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks now. "And yours was Gumpa." They stood there crying and laughing at the same time, that specific emotional overflow that happens when something impossible becomes real, when the story you heard your whole life suddenly steps out of history and into the present tense. The cicadas screamed around them like they understood what was happening, like they were the chorus in a play that had been running for 5 generations, finally reaching its climax. Kasala held out his hand, palm up offering. Zora took it. And when their fingers touched, when their hands clasped under that ancient oak tree, something clicked into place in the universe. Some cosmic tumblers fell into alignment. Some promise made in darkness was finally being kept in the light. "They held hands in the water," Zora whispered. "So we could hold hands on dry land," Kasala finished. They stood there a long time, hands clasped, tears drying on their faces, both of them feeling the weight and the lightness of carrying a story that had just become theirs to finish. Neither of them knew yet what this meant, but they both knew, bone deep and certain, that this meeting wasn't an accident. Ancestors don't wait 164 years for accidents. They wait for destiny.
What happened next was the kind of thing that makes you believe in divine timing, in ancestral intervention, in the idea that some things are written in the stars long before we're born to read them. Zora and Kasala stood under that oak tree, talking until the sun started its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose that seemed too beautiful for the magnitude of what was happening. They traded family stories like people trade business cards, except these stories had weight, had history, had blood in them. Zora told him about Abile, how she'd been 14 when she was stolen, how she'd watched her mother's face disappear into the crowd of villagers, how that scream had followed her across the ocean, how she'd survived 5 years of slavery before emancipation came, how she'd walked back to Mobile asking everyone about a boy named Gumpa, how she'd married Kofi and had 7 children and lived to be 93 years old, tapping that rhythm until her last breath. Kasala told her about Gumpa, how he'd been 16, tall and strong, taken mid-harvest when his hands were still sticky with mango juice, how he'd survived 4 years of slavery, working cotton until his hands bled, how he'd helped buy the land for Africa Town, had been one of the original founders, how he'd married Amma and had 9 children and lived to be 87, teaching every single one of them the rhythm and making them promise to teach their children. "Wait," Zora said suddenly, pulling out her phone with shaking hands. "I have pictures, old family photos. My grandmother gave me copies before she passed." She scrolled through her camera roll, found the folder labeled Ancestors, and pulled up a faded sepia photograph from the early 1900s. A group of elderly people standing in front of a small wooden church, their faces serious, their eyes having seen too much. "That's Abile," she said, pointing to a tiny woman in the center, no more than 5 feet tall, wearing a white dress and a head wrap. This was taken in 1921, 2 years before she died. Kasala leaned in close, studying the photo, and his breath caught. "Pull up your camera," he said urgently, fishing his own phone out of his pocket. I have something. He found his own family folder, scrolled to a photograph from roughly the same era. A group of elderly men standing in front of what looked like the same church, maybe taken the same day, maybe just the same community event. "That's Gumpa," he said, his voice thick. "Third from the left. This was 1919. They held their phones side by side, comparing photos, and even though the images were nearly a century old, even though time had weathered the faces and faded the details, they could see it. The same cheekbones, the same set of the shoulders, the same something in the eyes that marked them as kin. "Oh my God," Zora whispered. "Kasola, we need to—" "DNA test," he finished. "We need to DNA test." 3 weeks later, both of them had spit into tubes and sent them off to every genetic testing service they could find. 23andMe, Ancestry, African Ancestry, even the university research programs that specialized in African diaspora genetics. And while they waited for results, something else started happening. They couldn't stay away from each other. It started innocent enough: coffee to discuss family trees, lunch to compare old documents, dinner to review historical records. They told themselves it was just about the research, just about honoring their ancestors, just about making sure the story was told right. But the truth was different, and they both knew it. There was chemistry between them that had nothing to do with shared history and everything to do with who they were right now, in this moment, in this timeline. The way Zora laughed made something in Kasola's chest feel light. The way Kasola listened, really listened, made Zora feel seen in ways she hadn't been before. They'd meet at the cemetery, at the same oak tree, and talk for hours about their lives, their dreams, their fears, about what it meant to be descended from people who'd survived the unsurvivable, about the weight of carrying these stories forward, about whether you could ever really know someone, or whether we're all just showing each other the parts of ourselves we think the other person wants to see. "I feel like I've known you forever," Zora said one evening, sitting on the ground with her back against the oak tree watching fireflies start their evening dance. "Maybe we have," Kasola said. "Maybe this is just us picking up where they left off." Family from both sides started getting involved. Zora's grandmother's sister, now 87 years old, came to meet Kasola and cried when she heard him tap the rhythm. Kasola's uncle, a history professor at Alabama State, started digging through archives, pulling out every document he could find about the Clatilla survivors. They discovered that Gumpa and Abile lived less than 4 miles apart for 60 years and never knew it, that their children had probably gone to the same Juneteenth celebrations, the same church revivals, the same community gatherings, that the families had been orbiting each other for generations, always close, never connecting. Until now. 3 months after that first meeting in the cemetery, all the genetic testing results came back. Every single one of them said the same thing. Zora and Kasola were fifth cousins. Fifth cousins, meaning they shared great-great-great-great-great-grandparents, meaning that yes, Gumpa and Abile were young enough to be their shared ancestors, meaning that the boy and girl who held hands in the Atlantic Ocean were the reason both of them existed. The genetic markers were clear. The African ancestry breakdown matched. The family trees, when drawn out on paper, converged at exactly the point where 2 teenagers survived a slave ship together. The night they got the results, they met at the cemetery again, because where else would you go to process something like this? They sat under the oak tree in the darkness, the same darkness that had once held their ancestors in the belly of a ship. Except this darkness was gentle, was chosen, was full of stars. "So it's real," Zora said softly. "Everything they told us, everything we carried, it was all real." "It was all real," Kasola repeated. "They held on to each other. They survived. They passed down the story. And we found each other." There was a long pause, filled with cicada song and the distant sound of cars and the rustle of leaves overhead. Then Zora said, very quietly, "I'm falling in love with you." Kasola turned to look at her, his face barely visible in the starlight. "I'm already there," he said. They both knew what this meant. They both knew the questions it would raise. Fifth cousins was distant enough to be legal in every state, safe enough genetically to be no concern. But they also knew some people wouldn't understand, would think it was strange, would miss the whole point. But the ancestors didn't wait 164 years for them to worry about what other people thought. The ancestors waited 164 years for this exact moment. For two people who never should have met to find each other in a cemetery, under an oak tree, carrying a rhythm that refused to die. For survival to become love. For a promise made in chains to be kept in freedom. Kasola took Zora's hand the same way Gumpa had taken Abile's in the black water of Mobile River. We don't have to rush this. We don't have to figure it all out tonight. But I need you to know I believe this was meant to happen. I believe they've been working on this longer than we've been alive. Zora squeezed his hand, tears streaming down her face in the darkness. Then let's not make them wait any longer, she whispered. And somewhere, in whatever space holds the spirits of those who came before, two teenagers who never got their own love story smiled, because they were finally going to get their ending, just in someone else's beginning.
Love, when it comes from ancestors, moves different than regular love. It doesn't creep in slow and cautious. It doesn't ask permission or wait for the right timing. It comes in like a flood, like something that's been held back too long and finally found a crack in the dam. That's how it was for Zora and Kasola. They fell into each other the way their ancestors had fallen into that river, urgent, necessary, choosing life over death, choosing each other over everything else. But it wasn't reckless. It was reverent. Every date felt like a prayer. Every conversation felt like continuing something that had started 164 years ago. Every time they held hands, they could feel the weight of other hands that had held on in the darkness, that had refused to let go even when letting go would have been easier. Kasola took Zora to the Mobile History Museum where they kept artifacts from the Clotida. They stood in front of a piece of the ship's hull that had been preserved, raised from the river bottom after more than a century underwater, and they both cried because their ancestors had touched that wood, had been chained near that wood, had tapped their rhythm on that wood. Zora took Kasola to a seafood restaurant on the bay and told him about her research, about ocean currents and coral reefs, about how water has memory, about how the Atlantic Ocean still carries the DNA of every person who died in it. Sometimes I'm out on the research boat, she said, and I think about the Middle Passage, about all those bodies that went into the water, and I wonder if that's why I study oceans. Like maybe I'm looking for them, looking for proof that they mattered, that they're still here somehow. Kasola reached across the table and took her hand. They're still here, he said. They're sitting right here with us. They're in your cheekbones and my shoulders and the rhythm we both know. They didn't disappear. They just changed form. The family started meeting each other. Zora's mother and Kasola's father sat down over Sunday dinner and realized they'd probably crossed paths dozens of times growing up in Mobile, had gone to rival high schools, had friends in common, had been orbiting each other just like their ancestors had. Kasola's grandmother, 91 years old and sharp as a tack, held Zora's face in her hands and said, "Baby, you got Abile's eyes. I seen pictures. You got her exact eyes. And yo grandmama, she was tapping that rhythm the day she died. Last thing she did. 2 slow, 1 fast. Like she was saying goodbye to somebody we couldn't see." Zora's great aunt told Kasola stories about Abile that hadn't made it into the official family history. Like how she used to wake up screaming sometimes, calling out in a language nobody understood anymore. How she'd go to the river and stand at the edge of the water and tap on the pilings of the dock. How she told her daughters she was talking to the boy who saved her, and when they'd ask what boy, she'd just say, "He knows who he is." The more they learned, the more clear it became Gumpa and Abile had never stopped looking for each other, had never stopped believing, had carried each other through every single day of their long lives, even though they never got to meet again. "That's a lot to live up to," Zora said one night, lying in Kasola's arms in her hotel room. She'd extended her stay in Mobile indefinitely, had called her lab in California and asked for a leave of absence. Some things were more important than deadlines. "We're not living up to anything," Kasola said, running his fingers through her locks. "We're completing something.
We're finishing what they started. That's different. Is it though? Zora turned to him. What if we mess this up? What if we're not strong enough to carry this? Kasola was quiet for a moment, thinking. He finally said, they survived a slave ship. They survived separation and slavery and never seeing each other again. They survived enough to pass down the story, to teach the rhythm, to make sure we'd be here right now having this conversation. You think they did all that just for us to be afraid? Zora smiled despite herself. When you put it that way. We're their wildest dream, Kasola continued. We're free. We're educated. We're choosing each other instead of having someone choose for us. We get to hold hands, and nobody can take that away from us. That's not pressure. That's privilege. 6 months after they met in the cemetery, Kasola moved back to Mobile. He left his architecture firm in Atlanta and opened his own practice, specializing in historical preservation, focusing on sites related to African American history. His first project was designing an expanded memorial for the Clotilda survivors. Zora had transferred to the Dauphin Island Sea Lab, where she could continue her research while being close to home, close to Kasola, close to the place where it all began. They bought a small house together in Africatown, on a street that ran between where Gumpa had lived and where Abili had lived, right in the middle of the distance that had kept them apart. The house needed work, but it had good bones and a backyard with an old oak tree that could have been the great-great-grandchild of the tree where they'd first met. They spent weekends fixing it up, painting walls and refinishing floors and planting a garden, and every single thing they did felt significant, felt like building something that would last. Kasola's mother came over one Saturday with old family recipes written in her grandmother's handwriting. She said, Gumpa's wife Amma wrote these down. Y'all should have them, should cook them, should remember that survival tastes like something. Zora's great-aunt brought over seeds saved from Abili's original garden, passed down through 5 generations. She says she grew okra and collards and tomatoes. Plant these, grow them, eat from the same earth she ate from. They were building a life, yes, but they were also building a shrine, a living memorial, a place where the past and present could exist together without one erasing the other. One evening, sitting on their back porch, watching the sunset, Zora said, I want to marry you. Kasola turned to her, surprised not by the sentiment but by the directness of it. I want to marry you too, he said. I've known it since the cemetery, since the moment you tapped back. Then let's do it, Zora said. Let's not wait. They waited long enough. For us. Kasola smiled, that slow smile that made his whole face light up. When? Zora thought for a moment, doing the math, in her head. June 15th, 2025. Exactly 165 years to the day Africatown was founded. 165 years to the day our ancestors stopped running and started building. That's when we should do it. Kasola took her hand and tapped their shared rhythm on her palm. June 15th it is, he said, under the oak tree where we met. Under the oak tree where they never got to meet, Zora corrected softly, where they're finally meeting now. Kasola finished. Through us. They sat there, in the gathering dark, hands clasped, feeling the weight of history and the lightness of future pressing on them in equal measure, knowing that some promises take more than one lifetime to keep. But that's okay, because some love is strong enough to wait. Some love is strong enough to survive. Some love is strong enough to reach across 165 years and say, I found you. Finally, I found you, and I'm never letting go again.
Planning a wedding is one thing. Planning a wedding that's been 165 years in the making, that's something else entirely. Zora and Kasola didn't just want a ceremony. They wanted a homecoming. They wanted every ancestor who'd tapped that rhythm to feel seen, honored, remembered. They wanted the wedding to be a bridge between worlds, between past and present, between the ones who survived and the ones who got to thrive because of that survival. The invitations went out to both families, and when people saw the date, June 15th, 2025, the anniversary of Africatown's founding, they understood immediately. This wasn't just a wedding. This was a sacred reunion. This was history completing itself. Zora's mother cried when she opened the invitation. Not sad tears, the kind of tears that come when you witness something holy, something that makes you believe in a love bigger than human understanding. Kosola's father called him and said, "Son, your great-great-grandfather is smiling so hard right now, heaven probably has to wear sunglasses." They decided to hold the ceremony in the original Africatown cemetery, under the very oak tree where they'd first heard each other's rhythm, the same tree that had sheltered the first generation of free Africans in Alabama, the same tree that had probably listened to Gumpa and Abile tell their stories to their children, not knowing those children would one day produce the very people standing beneath its branches wearing wedding clothes. Zora found her great-great-grandmother's Abile's wedding ring in a family Bible her aunt had kept. It was a simple silver band worn thin by 93 years of living, bent slightly out of shape, but still whole, still beautiful. The inside was engraved with a single word in what they eventually identified as Yoruba, Alafia, peace. She never took it off, Zora's aunt said, pressing the ring into Zora's palm. Not once in 75 years of marriage. She wore it until the day she died, and then my grandmother took it off her finger and saved it. Said, "Someone in this family gonna need this one day. Guess she met you." Kosola's uncle brought him Gumpa's pocket watch, a gold piece with a cracked face that didn't keep time anymore, but had been passed down through the men in his family like a sacred relic. On the back was an inscription that had been added later, probably after emancipation when Gumpa learned to read English. From darkness to light, from death to life, we survived. He bought this with the first money he ever earned as a free man, used it to time his days, to remember that time belonged to him now, not to some master. He'd tap on it when he was thinking. You could hear that rhythm on metal if you listened close. 2 slow, 1 fast, like a heartbeat. They had it restored, had the mechanism fixed so it would keep time again. Kosola would wear it pinned to his lapel on the wedding day, letting Gumpa's watch mark the moments of his descendants' joy. The families came together for a joint dinner 6 weeks before the wedding, and it was like watching 2 halves of a broken plate realize they fit back together. People who'd never met before discovered they knew the same songs, told the same stories, remembered the same sayings that had no source anyone could name. Kosola's grandmother and Zora's great-aunt sat in a corner comparing family recipes and realized they both made the okra stew the same way, with the same specific spices that you couldn't find in stores anymore, that had to be grown or traded for. "That's Abile's recipe. That's Gumpa's recipe," Kosola's grandmother insisted. Then they looked at each other and laughed, understanding dawning. It was probably the same recipe from the same village in Africa, carried across the ocean in memory, preserved through generations, proof that some things survive even when everything else is taken. The wedding planning became a community effort. The elders took over, insisting that this wedding needed to be done right, needed to honor tradition, needed to incorporate rituals that had been passed down from the Clotilda survivors themselves. There would be a libation ceremony, pouring water for the ancestors who couldn't be there in body, but were definitely there in spirit. There would be jumping the broom, that old tradition that came from when enslaved people couldn't legally marry, but created their own ceremonies anyway. There would be Yoruba blessings that some of the older families still remembered phonetically, even if they didn't know what all the words meant anymore. Zora designed her dress herself, a fusion of modern style and traditional African fabrics, white lace for the present, kente cloth for the past, cowrie shells stitched into the bodice because cowrie shells were once currency and blessing and beauty all at once.
She wore her locks in an elaborate crown, wrapped with white ribbon and fresh jasmine that smelled like the gardens Abile used to tend. Kosola's suit was cream linen, cut modern but with traditional mudcloth accents on the lapels. He had a tailor embroidered the wedding date on the inside pocket in gold thread, along with two other dates, 1860, when the Clotilda landed, and 2024, when he and Zora met. 3 dates that told a complete story. The guest list grew beyond what they'd originally planned. Word spread through Africatown and beyond about what this wedding represented, and people who'd never met Zora or Kosola asked if they could come, if they could witness, if they could be part of history completing itself. They said yes to everyone. This wasn't a private celebration. This was communal healing. This was collective testimony. This was every person who'd ever been separated from someone they loved finally getting to see a reunion. The night before the wedding, both families gathered at the cemetery for a private ceremony. They poured libations at Gumpa and Abile's graves, talked to them like they were right there listening, because they were, and promised to honor their memory, not just with tears, but with joy. "You didn't survive so we could be sad," Kosola's grandmother said to Gumpa's headstone. "You survived so we could be free, so we could love who we want and marry who we choose, and build the lives you only got to dream about. Tomorrow we celebrate that. Tomorrow we finish what you started." Zora knelt by Abile's grave and placed a white rose on the weathered stone. "I found him, Grandma. I found your boy. He's tall and kind and strong, just like you said he'd be. And tomorrow, I'm going to marry his great-great-grandson. Tomorrow, we're going to do what you couldn't do. We're going to stand together in the light. We're going to speak our vows out loud where everyone can hear us. We're going to hold hands and nobody can take that away from us. This is for you. This whole thing is for you." The moon rose full and bright over Africatown that night, and if you listened close, if you really paid attention, you could almost hear 2 rhythms tapping in harmony somewhere between earth and sky. Tap, tap, tap. Tap, tap, tap. The ancestors were already at the ceremony, claiming their seats, making sure everything was ready for the reunion they'd been orchestrating for 165 years. Tomorrow, 2 families separated by slavery would be joined by marriage. Tomorrow, a promise made in darkness would be sealed in light. Tomorrow, the rhythm that had waited for 5 generations would finally get its resolution. Tomorrow, the circle that began on a burning ship would close under an oak tree. Tomorrow, love would prove itself stronger than death, than distance, than time itself. Tomorrow couldn't come fast enough, but the ancestors knew how to wait. They'd been practicing for a century and a half.
June 15th, 2025, dawned clear and warm, the kind of morning that feels like blessing before it feels like weather. The cemetery had been transformed. White chairs arranged in a semicircle under the oak tree, white rose petals scattered along the grass, creating an aisle. Strings of lights wrapped around branches that would glow like stars when the sun went down. Flowers everywhere, gardenias and jasmine and magnolia, all the flowers that bloom in Alabama soil, all the flowers the Clotilda survivors would have planted in their first gardens. The crowd started gathering early, family from both sides wearing their finest, children in pressed clothes being reminded to sit still, elders being helped to their seats with the reverence due to those who remember when remembering was survival. But it wasn't just family. Word had spread through Mobile, through Alabama, through the networks of people descended from the Clotilda and other ships, through the communities that understand what it means to survive, to remember, to honor. They came from Birmingham and Montgomery, from Atlanta and Jackson, from as far as California and New York and Texas. They came because this wedding was bigger than 2 people. This wedding was testimony. By the time the ceremony was set to begin, there were over 300 people present, spilling beyond the chairs, standing in the grass, leaning against headstones of ancestors who surely didn't mind the company. The preacher arrived, a 93-year-old man named Reverend Samuel Washington, himself a descendant of a Clotilda survivor, born and raised in Africatown, who'd married 3 generations of these families and was honored beyond words to close this particular circle. He stood under the oak tree in his white robe with a purple stole, his Bible held in hands that trembled with age but not with uncertainty. When the crowd quieted, he looked out at them and said, "Y'all know what we're doing here today. This ain't just a wedding. This is resurrection. This is proof that love don't die just because the body does. This is 165 years of prayers being answered." The crowd responded with amens and hallelujahs that rolled through the cemetery like thunder. Then the music started. Not recorded music. A live drummer had been brought in, a man who studied traditional West African rhythms, who understood that this ceremony needed percussion, needed heartbeat, needed the sounds that Gumpa and Abile would have recognized. The wedding party walked down the aisle first, Kosola's groomsmen in cream suits, Zora's bridesmaids in dresses the color of earth and sky. Then came the mothers, both weeping before they'd taken 3 steps, holding on to each other for support. These women whose ancestors had survived parallel hells and whose children were about to complete the circle. Then came Kosola. He walked down the aisle alone because Gumpa had no father to walk with him, had been alone in so many ways. But he wasn't really alone. His grandfather walked beside him in spirit, his great-grandfather, his great-great-grandfather. 5 generations of men who taught him how to be strong, how to survive, how to tap that rhythm when the world got too heavy. He wore Gumpa's pocket watch pinned to his cream linen suit. He wore his great-grandfather's cufflinks. He wore the weight of every ancestor who dreamed of this moment without knowing what shape it would take. When he reached the tree, he turned to wait, and his eyes were already wet. The drummer changed the rhythm, slowed it down, made it sacred. And then Zora appeared at the top of the aisle. The crowd gasped, not just because she was beautiful, though she was, stunning in white lace and kente cloth and jasmine, but for a moment, just for a moment, everyone there saw Abile, saw that 14-year-old girl who'd survived the unsurvivable, superimposed on her great-great-great-great-great-granddaughter, walking toward the love that girl had found and lost. Zora walked alone too, because Abile's father never knew where her daughter went, never knew if she survived. But her grandmother walked with her great-grandmother, her great-great-great-great-great-grandmother, 5 generations of women who taught her how to be fierce, how to endure, how to tap that rhythm when she needed reminding that she came from survivors. She wore Abile's ring on a chain around her neck until the ceremony when it would move to her finger. She wore her grandmother's earrings. She wore the strength of every ancestor who whispered her name before she was born. When she reached Kosola, when their eyes met, when their hands clasped, the drummer stopped playing. The silence was so complete, you could hear birds in the distance, could hear the rustle of leaves, could hear, if you listened with your soul instead of your ears, the sound of 2 teenagers in a ship's hold breathing easier because their story was finally being finished. Reverend Washington let the silence hold for a long moment. Then he spoke. 165 years ago, 2 children held hands in darkness and made a promise without words. Today, their children's 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 children gonna speak that promise out loud. And I dare, he raised his voice, I dare the devil himself to open his mouth today.
I dare any force in heaven or earth or hell to say these two don't belong together. I dare anyone to deny that this is holy work." The crowd erupted. Applause and amens and that call and response that happens in black churches when the spirit hits just right. The ceremony that followed was part traditional, part created, all sacred. They poured libations, naming every ancestor they could remember and some they couldn't, inviting them to witness. They jumped the broom that had been used at 5 generations of family weddings. They spoke vows in English and in Yoruba, stumbling over pronunciations, but getting the spirit right. When it came time for their personal vows, Zora went first. She looked at Kosolo with tears streaming down her face and said, "My ancestor held your ancestor's hand in the dark so we could hold each other in the light. She tapped a rhythm on a ship's hold so I could hear your answer in a cemetery. She survived 52 days of hell so I could have this one day of heaven. I promise to honor her survival with my joy. I promise to honor her strength with my gentleness. I promise to hold your hand the way she held his, like my life depends on it, because maybe it does. Maybe we only get this one lifetime to finish what they started, so let's not waste it. Let's love each other the way they would have if they'd been given the chance. Let's build the life they dreamed of in the darkness. Let's be their wildest, most beautiful, most impossible prayer answered." There wasn't a dry eye in the cemetery. Kosola could barely speak through his own tears, but he managed to say, "They survived the water, so we could promise on dry land. He kept the rhythm so I could answer your call. He lived 87 years remembering a girl he met in chains so I could spend the rest of my life loving the woman who carries her name. I promise to be worthy of that weight. I promise to make our ancestors proud. I promise to tap our rhythm every single day for the rest of my life so you always know where to find me. I promise to hold on to you the way he held on to her, with everything I have, with everything I am, for as long as breath remains in this body." Reverend Washington could barely compose himself enough to continue, but he cleared his throat and said, "By the power vested in me by the state of Alabama and by every ancestor standing witness in this place, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may—" But before he could finish, before he could say kiss the bride, every elder in the crowd started tapping. On their canes, on their programs, on their thighs, on the chairs, on the ground. Tap, 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 tap. Tap, 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 tap. Tap, tap, tap. Tap, tap, tap. The rhythm Gumpa had tapped in 1860. The rhythm Abibe had answered. The rhythm that had waited 165 years for this exact moment. The rhythm, multiplied by 300 people, sounded like thunder, like heartbeat, like the whole cemetery was alive, breathing, celebrating. And Kosola kissed Zora under that oak tree while their ancestors drummed them home.
The celebration that followed was the kind that makes you believe joy is a form of resistance, that dancing is a form of prayer, that surviving and thriving are two parts of the same sacred story. They cut the wedding cake under strings of lights shaped like stars, and the cake itself was a work of art, 3 layers representing the ship, the survival, and the reunion, decorated with edible flowers and the rhythm tapped out in gold leaf, tap, tap, tap. The DJ played everything. Sweet Honey in the Rock singing spirituals that the Clotilda survivors would have recognized. Boona Boy with beats that connected them back to Africa. Alabama Shakes because this was Alabama soil they were celebrating on. An old school soul, the kind that makes grandmothers get up and show young folks how to really dance, how to move like joy is a language older than words. Nobody sat down once. 5-year-olds dance with 90-year-olds. People who just met dance like they'd known each other forever, because in a way they had. They were all connected by water, by memory, by the decision to remember instead of forget. Zora and Kasola danced their first dance to a song that had been written specifically for them by a cousin who was a musician. A song about waiting, about finding, about coming home. And while they swayed in the center of the circle, 300 people surrounded them, humming harmony, adding vocals, making the song bigger than 2 people could ever make it alone. "This is what it's supposed to feel like," Zora whispered against Kasola's shoulder. "This is what they were fighting for, not just to survive, to celebrate. We're living their dream," Kasola whispered back. "Right now, this moment, this is what they saw when they tapped that rhythm in the dark. They saw us." As the evening went on, stories started flowing. The elders gathered the young people and told them everything. The full histories, the hard truths, the beautiful resistance. They told them about Cujo Lewis, another Clotilda survivor who lived until 1935 and was interviewed, his story preserved. They told them about the Africa Town community that still existed, still fought, still preserved. They told them that this wedding wasn't an ending, it was a beginning. A reminder that some stories don't get resolved in one generation, that some love takes centuries to complete, that patience and faith and remembering are all forms of power. At the end of the night, as the party was winding down and the older folks were starting to head home, tired but happy, Zora and Kasola walked to the edge of the cemetery property, to the place where the original Clotilda survivors had built their first church, where they'd gathered to pray and sing and remind each other they were still human, still holy, still here. Only the foundation remained now, old stones covered in moss, barely visible in the grass. But if you knew what you were looking for, you could still see the outline of what had been. They knelt together in their wedding clothes and laid a wreath of white gardenias on those old stones. And then they spoke in Yoruba they had learned just for this moment, words taught to them by an elder who remembered them from his grandmother. Ekuisimio. Rest well. Ekuisimio. Rest well. Ati dele. We made it home. They stayed there for a long time, kneeling on that sacred ground, feeling the weight of what had just happened begin to settle into their bones. They'd done it. They'd completed the circle. They'd turned survival into celebration, trauma into triumph, separation into reunion. When they finally stood and turned back toward the oak tree where their families were still gathered, still celebrating, still refusing to let the night end, Zora said something that would become family legend, something her own great-great-grandchildren would repeat one day. "You think they're watching?" Kasola smiled, that smile that made his whole face light up like sunrise. "Baby, they're not watching, they're dancing." And somewhere, maybe in that space between heartbeats, maybe in the rustle of oak leaves, maybe in the very air of Africa Town itself, 2 teenagers who never got to grow old together were doing exactly that. They were standing hand in hand under that oak tree, wearing the faces they had at 16 and 14 before slavery tried to break them, before separation tried to kill them, and they were smiling so wide that heaven itself had to shade its eyes from the brightness of that joy. Gumpa pulled Abile close and said in the language they both spoke before it was stolen, "We did it. They found each other. They finished it." And Abile, fierce and small and eternal, looked up at him and said, "No, beloved, they didn't finish it. They continued it. This story doesn't end. It just keeps going, generation after generation, getting stronger each time. That's what survival means. That's what we bought with those 52 days, not an ending, a beginning that never stops beginning." As the last guests finally left, as Zora and Kasola walked hand in hand to their car with tin cans tied to the bumper and "Just Married" written in shaving cream, as the moon rose full and bright over Africa Town, the cemetery grew quiet again. But it wasn't an empty quiet. It was the quiet of completion, of satisfaction, of a job well done. If you'd stayed behind after everyone left, if you'd stood under that oak tree in the darkness and listened, really listened, you might have heard it one more time. The rhythm that crossed an ocean. The rhythm that survived a Holocaust. The rhythm that waited 165 years. The rhythm that said, "We are here. We survived. We did not forget. We did not let them erase us. We held on to each other across centuries and continents and the very grave itself. We are still here. We will always be here. This is our story. This is our song. This is our testimony." And to anyone listening, to anyone who needs to hear it, this is the message. If your people came through the water, any crossing, any journey that tried to kill them but didn't, if your granny taught you a song nobody else knows, if you ever tapped on a wall and somebody tapped back, if you carry a story that seems impossible but true, hear Miss Lovie tonight. The ancestors ain't done with you yet. They survived the ship so you could survive the storm. They kept the rhythm so one day, somewhere under the right oak tree, your blood would find its way back home. They held on in the darkness so you could walk in the light. They tapped that rhythm through 5 generations so you'd know you're not alone. You've never been alone. You're part of a story bigger and older and stronger than anything trying to break you. So keep tapping. Keep listening. Keep believing that some promises take longer than one lifetime to keep, but they get kept anyway. Because love, real love, ancestor love, the kind that survives everything, doesn't die when the body does. It just waits. It plants seeds, it whispers through generations, and one day, when the time is right, when the people are ready, when the circle needs closing, it blooms. It blooms into a girl named Zora meeting a boy named Kosola in a cemetery. It blooms into 2 families separated by slavery being joined by marriage. It blooms into a wedding under an oak tree where 300 people tap a rhythm that's been waiting for 165 years to be answered. It blooms into proof that we survive, not just to exist, but to thrive, not just to remember, but to celebrate, not just to endure, but to love. Zora and Kasola are living in Africatown right now. They're building their life. They're planning their family. They're keeping the rhythm alive. And one day, they'll teach their children the same story, the same rhythm, the same faith that some things are worth waiting for because the story doesn't end here. It never ends. It just keeps going, generation after generation, getting stronger each time, proving again and again that love is the most powerful force in the universe, that survival is sacred, that memory is resistance, that we are not who they said we were. We are who we've always been, unbreakable, unforgettable, unstoppable. We are the children of people who survived the unsurvivable. We are the answers to prayers whispered in the dark. We are the rhythm that refuses to die. Welcome home, beloved. Welcome home. We've been waiting on you since 1860, and we ain't going nowhere.